Hello, today we are going to talk about St. Thomas Aquinas. While Augustine is a clear shift in our movement from Greek philosophy to medieval philosophy, Aquinas really represents the sort of synthesis of Augustinian thought along with Aristotle, who is recently being rediscovered for Western philosophers. He's really the one who does the best job both incorporating Augustine and Aristotle. Others will end up doing a little bit more work with Plato, as we'll talk about with people like St. Bonaventure, or have different interpretations and takes on what it means to be an Aristotelian, as Bacon will. But Aquinas is generally seen as the greatest synthesis of these thoughts, and is usually seen as kind of the settler of medieval philosophy at its greatest point. Controversies will, of course, arise and discussions all around, but he really represents the beginning of a complete synthesis of Aristotle and Augustinian Platonic Christian thought. St. Thomas Aquinas was born in 1225 and will die in 1274. He was born in Italy and again generally regarded as the most influential philosopher since Augustine. He is also famously a member of the new Dominican order and will be a professor at the University of Paris and Naples and really helps establish Catholic theology moving forward. Generally speaking, the effect of his life is known as Thomism. This becomes the philosophical school of thought following Thomas. In the 20th century, many theologians and philosophers of this kind are referred to as neo or new Thomists, kind of reintroducing this thought within the modern perspective instead of the medieval one. Only Augustine is mentioned more in the Catholic Catechism than is Aquinas. Aquinas is mentioned 61 times specifically. Regarding his view and theory of knowledge, he is not like Plato, who held that man knows everything innately. Instead, generally, he's going to follow Aristotle with these. That reason is also seen as insufficient to know God or the world on itself. But natural reason may lead one to the porch of faith, bringing you up to this point. But there has to also be a given supplement to reason. Knowledge of God needs revelation, and knowledge of the world is also incomplete on its own, but you need experience. So you have to have just not only practical knowledge, but experience of things to really know what the world is like. God's revelation and man's experience do have an overlap. Therefore, in this overlapping area, man is able to know something about God through his experience. In particular, you know that the existence of God is something true. In 1226, 10 years after the establishment of the Dominican order, Thomas was born in Roccasecca, 80 miles south of Rome, about halfway between Rome and Naples. Technically, this city was a part of the Kingdom of Sicily, and thus sometimes Aquinas is referred to as a Sicilian, though he was born on the peninsula of Italy. Landulf, his father, was the Count of Aquino, and Theodora, his mother, was the Countess of Teano. His family was also related to the emperors Henry VI and Frederick II, as well as to the kings of Aragon, Castile, and France. Indeed, he was a fairly well-connected individual. These kings and emperors were also just now beginning to challenge the authority of the Pope for supremacy over temporal control of the land, something that Innocent III, the Pope a little while earlier, had kind of established was not going to be the case. Aquinas, interestingly enough, had no biographer, though he was very well known and involved in many of the important issues of the day. As such, the events of his life are often constructed from other material. The majority of information comes from a Dominican, who was a later companion of Thomas, named Guglielmo da Tocca, and most of that was gathered during the process of beatification, which will begin around 1303. So again, many of the stories might have first-hand account, but are really used for the process of trying to show how saintly Aquinas was as well. Thomas, was the younger son. So he was destined for monastic life. Generally speaking, the rule was the first son gets the title and the land, and the second son goes off and becomes a priest or a monk, depending on the level of piety that everything has. And if something happens to the first one, then you're brought back, right? The idea that you needed an heir and a spare was very important for noble families as well. His family really wanted him to become an influential abbot instead of a monastic, right? They wanted him to find connections within the church and kind of use that position to grant them money and power. This is not the way that Thomas will end up seeing his religious vocation going forward. As a very young child, as an infant, he was given a bath and once grabbed onto a piece of paper that had the Hail Mary written out on it. And he would not let go of it and screamed once it was removed. This became a pattern where the young Thomas would only relent from his cries if he ended up holding on a piece of paper with writing on it, preferably something with devotional material. Now, this is an interesting sort of depiction of him as a child to show this early piety going forward. But again, remember, many of these stories are circulating and being told when they're trying to show how much he deserved being called a saint later on. In 1227, tensions grew between the Pope and the Emperor, primarily on who would control Italy. Should it be Rome or Naples, right? The battle between these two kingdoms. And Aquinas' family was often caught in the middle, just as the town itself was. The newly elected Gregory IX became the Pope and excommunicated the Emperor Frederick II. In response, Frederick gathered his troops to fight the Pope's armies. This is fairly typical. The Aquinas sided with the emperor and not with the Dominican Pope. In 1230, Thomas was sent off to live with monks in Monte Cassino, but the monks were expelled by Frederick II in 1239, and it was turned into a fortress. The abbot of Monte Cassino wrote to Thomas's father that a boy of such talents should not be left in obscurity, and that he should be promoted and his wisdom brought forward. About the year 1236 or 1239, depending on who's counting and what version of the story we're getting, he was sent off to the University of Naples, the capital of the Kingdom of Sicily. The university was one of the few places that taught Aristotle at the time without any of the scrutiny of what's happening at the University of Paris. Here he learned from Martin and Peter of Ireland. Thomas could repeat the lessons, it said, with more depth and lucidity than his masters displayed. But Thomas liked to remain silent, usually being a very quiet person in class, and generally people thought that he lacked this intelligence, and he ended up gaining the nickname at this point, a dumb ox. Much later, Albert the Great, is credited for defending the young Thomas after a defense of a difficult thesis, exclaiming, "We call this young man a dumb ox, but his bellowing and doctrine will one day resound throughout the world." And indeed, this is the case. We're talking primarily about Aquinas and his impact, and not about the man who's usually seen as kind of his teacher into Aristotle later on, Albert the Great, who did a fantastic job with his philosophy as well. And if we had more time, we would get into Albert and all that he was able to add. Between 1242 and 1244, Thomas was 16 to 18 years old. For those of you keeping notes about that at home, he ended up taking the monastic habit and becoming a Dominican. Varying accounts raise up about this some point that his father initially opposed the decision, and that Thomas actually returned home to take care of his family for some period of time. He kind of went home and came back at some point. Others accounts actually will say that his brothers kidnapped him and brought him back home, that he really wanted to stay in the monastery. What we can kind of tell from all of these different stories is that his family really did not want him to become a friar, that is, poor. They didn't want him to become a Dominican, one of those mendicant orders, right, where they're going around begging and that are poor. Really, his family wanted him to become a monastic, but a rich, well-connected abbot who can help them out, right? Influential, as opposed to penitential, is really what the family was hoping for. Thomas was rather persistent and refused his family's visits. At one point, his mother was powerful enough to get him out of the monastery. Again, being very well connected, it was sometimes easier to just relent to the powers that be. They really tried to lure Thomas out of this with an offer to have a job, maybe even in the papal court. But he wanted to remain a Dominican. He wanted to study and learn and to be poor along these lines. The master of the order decided to send Thomas to Paris to avoid any sort of family interference, because if he is gone, then guess what? I can't be held responsible, and I don't have the weight of your family on top of me, right? So very basic here. On the way, he was then intercepted by his brothers and brought home, right? So again, we have this sort of story of his family kidnapping him. Maybe it's happened once or twice along the ways. But either way, he'll end up making his way back to Paris, where he will continue to study the Bible, Peter Lombard's 4 books of sentences, which we will encounter later, along with other devotional works. Really, his family tried as best they could to try to break some of his devotion, be it at home or in Paris or in a monastery. While at home, while he was kidnapped, they tried to break his devotion by sending an attractive girl to his room to seduce him. This did not work. He then seized the burning log, it said, and drove the lady out of his room and implored God give him the gift of chastity. It says that angels tightly bound his loins, so tight that he came with a cry, but never again experienced any carnal thoughts. About 1 to 3 years later, he was released from his family's captivity. His mom let him sneak out of the window, and he went off to the University of Paris. Right? So even his escape from his family couldn't be easy and normal and, okay, I guess you want to be a monk. Like, he had to escape out of that and really kind of show his own devotion that his family would relent upon. So that brings us to around 1245. He will return to monastic life and go off to Paris to study under Albert. 1248, Albert will go off to Cologne, and Aquinas went with him, but then will return to Paris after that. At some point, Thomas's family secured for him the abbacy of Monte Cassino, again, really trying to get him to have this well-connected position, but he refused it. And instead rather would stay studying and teaching. In 1252 to 1255, he will teach at Paris and become a bachelor of the sentences. Peter Lombard's philosophical work, the 4 books of sentences, which again we'll encounter later. In 1257, he became a master, but could not proceed any further because of the fight between the monks and the university. This is the same issue that will hold up Bonaventure at the same time. Aquinas was only 30 or so, but the rule said he had to be 35. So there's other technical issues there. In his inaugural address, his lecture, he was not sure what to preach on, and it said that a venerable friar appeared to him and gave him Psalm 103:13, where the subject is the vocation of the theologian. Later, this friar is said to be none other than Saint Dominic, the founder of that order. So, of course, this is fantastic for Aquinas, showing a very real connection to the founder of this order. Is oftentimes, next to Saint Dominic, the most important Dominican is, later on, Aquinas. He will also serve as regent in the Dominican house from 1256 to 59. In 1257, he was admitted to get his doctoral degree, same year as Bonaventure, and in 1258, Aquinas will begin work on his Summa contra Gentiles, or the sum of knowledge of those who were essentially not from a theological background, right? A work which was Aquinas' first synthesis of theology and philosophy, and really its basis was that of Aristotle, that is the Gentile, the non-believer, to whom that's going to be. This will end up creating a sort of interim term where he's going to be an itinerant professor, going from place to place, preaching, as it were, through philosophy, teaching this sort of thoughts. In 1259 through 68, He'll leave Paris and aid the Dominicans in Italy, including the Valencians, to establish studies there. This was in addition to the aiding of Albert in Germany and possibly again also going to the Netherlands. In 1268, the provincial chapter told Thomas to set up a study in Rome, but then he gets reassigned back to Paris. So we end up having this sort of moving all around over and over again where he's trying to lecture on Aristotle and Scripture together. Very much same sort of idea as we were seeing with Augustine before, where philosophy and theology are wedded together. This ends up coming a little bit to a head later on. Aquinas was also spent most of his energies upon the Mass and the presence of Christ in the Eucharist. He often laid his head on the altar and said that he could feel the heartbeat of God through the Eucharist. Thomas was frequently abstracted in what's known as ecstasies concerning the Eucharist. Naturally, from 1271 to 65, he was in Orvieto, where he composed liturgical texts for the feast of Corpus Christi for Pope Urban IV. From 65 to 68, he lived in Rome and began writing the Summa, which is his major work that we are reading sections out of today. In 1269, Albert the Great wanted to go back to the University of Paris, but he was unable to do so. And this allowed for his fellow Dominican and student Thomas to return to the University of Paris. From 1269 to 72, Aquinas will lecture at Paris, and this is usually the period where we're seeing him as an instructor at the University of Paris, his main sort of calling as far as philosophy goes. Here, his class was always overflowing, that everyone always wanted to be there. It said that men were more anxious to hear them than they would have been to hear Albert, and the times that Albert was there, just Aquinas was that enrapturing of a fellow. Likely, Thomas returned to confront the growing Aristotelians at the university and trying to make sure that they were not radical. In fact, they were often identified as radical Aristotelians, and it was causing quite the scandal philosophically and ecclesially at the university. Bonaventure also, by the way, was speaking out against them at this time, and we will get to Bonaventure shortly. Unfortunately for Aquinas, he was equated as a radical. Some of the friars, like William of Bagoline, who said, "The blind leads the blind," and Thomas was their chief, sort of thought, which is really not very accurate, but he was lumped in with that group as he was an Aristotelian, although far more rational than some of those other radicals were, and again, even spoke out against them. Aquinas was viewed as conceding too much to the realm of philosophy. Again, the idea for the universities at this time is that philosophy, following Augustine, was really in subservience to theology, and yet Aquinas appeared too much a philosopher and not enough a theologian for many of the school's discussions there. Right? And, Aquinas states that if Christianity is true, then it must make sense, and it must make sense in terms that are related to the ordinary, untheological ways in which we make sense of things. Right? Therefore, philosophy should be something that supports Christianity and not the other way around. Therefore, my efforts, Aquinas would say, towards philosophy are really only that, still subservient to theology. But then again, in 1272, during Lent, he was sent back to Italy. The university will go on strike to protest the bishop, and that summer Aquinas will go back to Naples to organize studies at the University of Naples. Really, the whole strike had all to do with interesting sorts of controversies surrounding Aristotle, especially by the time we get into the whole 1270s. It's all a big question about what place does Aristotle have in the universities, and in fact you end up getting greater pushback in places like England during this point where it's condemned early on, and later in 1277 same will happen in Paris. And as far as just tantalizing events of the day, the what do you do with Aristotle is a fantastic discussion at this point. But in 1273, Aquinas is spending most of his time still writing treatises on the Eucharist and spending his time in ecstasies connected with him and his Eucharistic practices. But when he completes the treatise in 1273 on the Eucharist, 3 of the brethren around him say that they saw him lifted in ecstasy, and they heard a voice proceeding from the crucifix on the altar saying, "Thou hast written well of me, Thomas. What reward will thou have?" Aquinas' response is, "None other than thyself, Lord." And similar declarations were said to also have happened at some other point in Orvieto and in Paris. All at the same time, he's also getting ill and unable to work. Famously, though, on December 6th, 1273, he lay aside his pen and would write no more. That day he had experienced an unusual long ecstasy during Mass. What was revealed to him, we can only guess from what his reply was to his father Reginald, ecclesial father, not biological, who urged him to continue his writing, and Aquinas said, "I can do no more. Such secrets have been revealed to me that all I have written now appears of little value," or famously, as mere straw. Right, so everything around him just doesn't hold up. All of his philosophical and theological writings pale compared to the experience he's had of the divine, these ecstasies, and he will not write anymore. So this is kind of the end of his writing career. He'll end up going on the way to Lyon. He was asked by Pope Gregory X to aid at the Council of Lyon, and he'll travel very slowly along the way. He's very much fatigued at this point, consumed with illness. His travel companion tried to lift his spirits by joking that he and Bonaventure might become cardinals while they were there at the council, as Bonaventure was also heading to the council. But Aquinas told him to end all that sort of banter, right? That would just be issues of vanity, and that's not what he wanted to think about. That he wasn't involved in his mind in getting promoted to high rank, but simply that of doing what the Pope required of him at this time. Along this way, he had stopped at his niece's palace, the Countess Francesca di Sassiano, because he was too ill to proceed. While monks from the local Cistercian monastery will end up visiting him and aiding him along this way. At a certain point, he realizes that he's not going to be able to go anymore, that his relatives, his niece's palace is where he's going to die. So he requested to be transported instead to a religious house. He wanted to go to a monastery instead of a palace and die there. He was then brought to the Abbey of Fossa Nova, and a month later he will die on March 7th, 1274. There's an image of the abbey right there. Now, in many ways, we would look at Aquinas at this point and go, well, clearly you're destined for sainthood. This becomes the sort of thought a lot of people had, including the monks there that believed he was destined. So what did they do? Well, they didn't gather up his works. They gathered up his body and tried to hide it so that it couldn't be taken, because at this point it would be valued as a good relic to have, the whole body of a saint who had indeed passed there. Thomas, at this point, having already passed, appeared to the prior in a vision and told them not to hide his body. The body was therefore left on display for years until Peter of Tarentese, a colleague of Thomas's, became the Pope in 1276, and the Cistercians believed that the Dominicans would take this uncorrupted body away. So, if we can't keep the body, and it's going to be taken from us, we got to take the next best thing, and they just take his head, and they remove his head, and will hide his head, but give and relent of the body. A few years later, of course, the body was moved, and in 1288, Thomas's sister wanted her brother's remains, and of course they're not going to give up all of his remains. Instead, they just sent her one of his hands. Again, very valuable, and everyone's wanting a piece, literally, of Thomas Aquinas. Later, a thumb was removed and given to a Dominican cardinal as well. And so again, we have pieces here and there. In 1303, a Dominican Pope Benedict XI begins to look into the process of actually canonizing Aquinas as a saint, especially because of a number of miracles that have taken place connected with him. This was a fairly troublesome period for popes at this time, and there was a large amount of turnover. So kind of doing this quickly would be good. If not, it's going to have to wait longer, and it wasn't done quick enough. So it took until 1317 that a new Pope, John the 22nd in Avignon, responds to a miracle as well and wants to canonize Thomas, but the process was not all written down and miracles needed to be confirmed. So the official process doesn't begin until September 12th of 1318 to canonize him, and he wasn't finally canonized until done by John the 22nd on 18th of July 1323. So quite a long time until this is finally happening. While Aquinas considered his philosophy to be mere straw compared to the visions of God, Aquinas really did believe that there was a harmony that existed between faith and reason, that faith consolidates, integrates, and illuminates what reason acquires. Grace does not annihilate, but perfects human nature and knowing. And so we end up having interesting discussions that Aquinas will have about the will and the good and act and potency and essence and existence. And these become very familiar sort of language for the Thomist. The main philosophical idea between act and potency and essence and existence is that every finite being is made up of act and potency, of essence and existence. Existence brings the potency of an essence into act, but itself is limited by that potency. Right? So what does this mean? And if some of you are needing a little break here, and I understand that entirely. Things exist and have an essence. Right? There is what you are, and there is the existence around you. Right? That you have a certain thing that you are. Your soul, to go with the language of both Plato and Augustine and Aquinas. Your will would kind of define in some ways what you are, but your body is also part of that, especially for the Christian theologians following people like St. Irenaeus of Lyon, that you are your body and your soul, not just one without the other. But your essence is all of this stuff wrapped up together. Then there is the existence, the what you do, what you are surrounded with, how you interact with things. And your doing of things, your existing in the world, takes some of those things that are a part of your essence in potency and will bring them into act, right? What you are potentially able to do, and it makes it which is actually done. So again, we have the sort of division between you are and what are you versus what are you kind of, as well as the idea of what you can do and what you do, and these sorts of relations along with that. God alone is the subsistent being who has no distinction between essence and existence, that all of God's essence is in his acting for Aquinas. Others might have some sort of divisions on things, but there's this notion of divine simplicity held by Aquinas. Others, especially people like Gregory of Palamas, about a millennia later, will end up arguing that we should be seeing God in God's essence and God's energies, that these become different. But for Aquinas, that they are seen as sort of essence and existence as the same sort of thing. For the will, it is determined by the good, right? People cannot choose evil, but rather for Aquinas, we only choose goods. Now, this is very interesting because initially we might want to reject this idea, or no, I made a really bad choice just the other day. But Aquinas will say you didn't make a really bad choice because you were choosing something that wasn't good. What made you make that choice was because you saw some good in it, even if, following Augustine, it was counterfeit, even if it was fake. Right? That you're always choosing something because of the goods that are being presented to it. Now, this doesn't mean that Aquinas thinks all goods are equal. Indeed, there are some goods that are better than others, right? Him choosing not to write anymore and do any more philosophy was because it paled in the goodness of living in this ecstasy that he had encountering Christ. Now, he wouldn't say that his writing wasn't good, but it wasn't the better good, right? So all of the times we can choose to do something that's not the best, but we're still choosing it because it is good. We don't choose things to be evil. Even the bad things we choose are because we see some good in them. Most of the framework of Aquinas's philosophy and theology was a reworking of Peter Lombard's sentences. His duties consisted principally in explaining these sentences of Peter Lombard and the commentaries on this textbook of theology as it was for the University of Paris. And he furnished the materials, and in great part this becomes the framework for the far more complete Summa Theologica that Aquinas will do, especially in comparison to the Lombard sentences. And this is the way that he is really a translator of Aristotle. He's viewed in this way of transmitting Aristotle to the West. Albert did a fantastic job before him, and we obviously can't take that away. But Aquinas is kind of seen as the complete version of that. You can only see that Aquinas is silently changed or intentionally misrepresents Aristotle for about a half a dozen or so different times. And this is usually on purpose as he's trying to kind of correct it in his way without drawing attention to it at the same time, not being one of those radicals that believes everything Aristotle says is correct. More or less, he did to Aristotle what Augustine did to Plato. Right? He says, right, taking from the Platonists what seemed right in their thought and changing what seemed to be wrong. This is what Augustine said of Plato. And so Aquinas would do the same thing. I took what's right of Aristotle and changed what seemed to be wrong. And this is kind of the way that he moved forward with that. Like Augustine, Aquinas was a proficient writer. He would write many, many, many different works. His major ones are the Summa contra Gentiles, the Contra Orionis Gorgosium, and the Summa Theologica. Generally speaking, when somebody says the Summa, they're referring to the Summa Theologica. This becomes his foundational work, and in many ways is kind of the answer to theological questions for Catholics, as well as many sources for philosophical inquiry for Thomas all over. Now, the Summa Theologica has got three parts to it. There's the first part, there's the second part, and there's the third part. But that doesn't really address it because really the first part is the first part, the second part has got a first part of the second part, and the second part of the second part. And then there's the third part, and then there's the supplement to the third part that comes about after he said he wouldn't write anymore, but other people added stuff to it because it was from his lectures and it's his work. Anyways, right? So again, we have this interesting sort of connection. Each of these are broken up into questions and articles. And this is the kind of the way he wrote in this sort of dialectic fashion where an idea would be brought up. You have a question, you have the answer, I answer that, however, blah, 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 giving his answers, then a reply to the objections that were given at the very beginning. It's very Socratic in this same sort of nature. The areas of the prima pars of the first part will talk about sacred doctrine, there being one God, the blessed Trinity, creation, angels, 6 days, man, the governance of creatures. First part of the second part talks about man's last end, human acts, passions, habits, vice and sin, law and grace. The second part of the second part, faith, hope, charity, prudence, justice, fortitude, right? We get all those virtues, while their last type talked a little bit about vices and sins, right? Temperance as well is included in this part, and acts which pertain to certain individuals. The third part addresses the incarnation, the life of Christ, sacraments, baptism, confirmation, Eucharist, penance, right? The list of sacraments. And the rest of the supplement includes further discussion on penance, unction, orders, matrimony, the resurrection, and a number of appendices. So this is kind of the way that it's structured, right? So we have the first part largely just talking about God. The second part talks about people, right? Apart from that, right, what are vices, what are virtues? Third part about Christ and the church through the sacraments, right? It essentially is the easy way to kind of divide these up in your own head as you're wanting to look them up and find the answers to whatever question you want. Likely Aquinas, as long as it's not a super modern question, talked about it in one way or the other. Amongst other things, Aquinas is known for his proofs for the existence of God. He will end up having 5 of them as they're listed out in the Summa Theologica, Part 1, Question 2, Article 3, on whether or not God exists. He answers that the existence of God can be proved in 5 ways. What's really interesting is, before anything else, we're able to kind of see that he's growing on the notions of proofs for the existence of God, primarily through an understanding of Aristotle, and then kind of expanding on that through other discussions, right? If we were to actually look at Article 2, instead of just Article 3, right, whether it can be demonstrated that God exists, he says, I answer that demonstrations can be made themselves in 2 ways. One is through the cause, called a priori, and that is to argue from what is prior absolutely. What is it that exists without you? The other is through the effect, called a demonstration, or a posteriori, right, from the second hand. That is to argue from what is prior relatively only to us. When an effect is better known to us than its cause, from the effect we proceed to the knowledge of the cause. Right? When we know the effect, but we don't know the cause, we're going to proceed from what we know from this effect. And this is the way we're going to do it. From every effect, the existence of its proper cause can be demonstrated, so long as its effects are better known to us. Because since every effect depends upon its cause, if their effect exists, the cause must, by its very nature, be pre-existent. Hence the existence of God, insofar as it is not self-evident to us, it is not an a priori knowledge that we already contain, can be demonstrated from those of the effects which are known to us, and therefore the existence of God can be proven through a posteriori proofs, right? From what we can tell from the effects, we can root these back and understand the cause of something. Just as if you saw an accident on the road, you saw 2 cars in a state of disrepair, radiator fluid and glass everywhere, right? You can tell from careful observation what happened. Right? So-and-so was driving this way, that person was driving the other way. You can see skid marks where this person tried to brake. You can tell from certain tire marks how this person hit, and a trained eye can even probably tell on what part of the car was originally hit and this, that, and the other, right? The more knowledgeable you are about the causes in general, the more you'd be able to tell about this specific one. The better your knowledge of the effects, your greater chance of the cause. And this is the same sort of argument that Aquinas is making. The first argument, and he says the first and more manifest way, is the argument from motion. And this is a sort of cosmological proof for the existence of God, and is drawing very, very heavily upon Aristotle and his arguments towards there needing to be a first mover, as the term will be used. He says, it is certain and evident to our senses that in the world some things are in motion. Now whatever is motion is put into motion by another, for nothing can be in motion except in its potentiality towards that which it is in motion, whereby a thing moves inasmuch as it is in act. Right here, notice again, we've got those discussions that we mentioned earlier of act and potency. Right, nothing is going to actually be doing something unless it has the potential to do it, and then there's something that needs to make that move that happens, right? But nothing can be reduced from potentiality to actuality except by something in a state of actuality. If everything is simply in potentiality, then nothing is actually going to be actual. So something actually has to be happening, otherwise nothing else is going to move. Thus, that which is inactually hot, as fire, makes wood, which is potentially hot, to be actually hot, and thereby moves and changes it. Now, it is not possible that the same thing should be at once in actuality and potentiality in the same respect. Right? You might have some wood that's not on fire, but that's not the same respect, right? But only in different respects. For what is actually hot cannot be simultaneously potentially hot, but it is simultaneously potentially cold. It is therefore impossible in that same respect, in that same way, that a thing should be both mover and moved, i.e. that it should move itself. Therefore, whatever is in motion must be put in motion by another. If that which is put in motion be itself be put in motion, then it also must needs that it is put in motion by another, and that, again, by another. But this cannot go on to infinity, because then there would actually be no first mover, and consequently no other mover, seeing that subsequent movers move only inasmuch as they are put in motion by a first mover, as the staff moves only because it is put in motion by the hand. Therefore, it is necessary to arrive at a first mover, put in motion by none other, and this everyone understands to be God. Right? This is the argument that if something is going to cause other things to move, this sort of cosmic push from potentiality to actuality, that there must be something that is not potential but only actual, that is moving everything else. This is the argument from motion. The second way, he says, there is an order of efficient causes. There is no case known, neither is it indeed possible, Aquinas continues, in which a thing is found to be the efficient cause of itself. Right? You didn't show up because you are you and on your own. For so it would be prior to itself, which is, of course, impossible. You are not your own grandfather. All right. Now, in effect, causes are not possible to go on to infinity, because all efficient causes following in order. The first is the cause of the intermediate cause, and the intermediate is the cause of the ultimate cause, whether the intermediate cause is several or only one. Now, to take away the cause is to take away the effect. Right? The ball won't move unless it is hit or struck. Right? Therefore, if there be no first cause amongst efficient causes, there will be no ultimate, nor any intermediate cause. But if in efficient cause it is possible to go on to infinity, there will be no first efficient cause, neither will there be an ultimate cause, nor any intermediate efficient causes, all of which is plainly false, because we do have other causes and effects that are around us. Therefore, it is necessary to admit a first efficient cause, to which everyone gives the name God. This becomes the next argument. Now, again, we just saw here with causes and effect is the same sort of argument that we had from the argument of motion. And the third way will follow very similar suit. The third is taken from possibility and necessity and runs thus. We find in nature things that are possible to be and to not be, since they are found to be generated and to corrupt. Consequently, they are possible to be and not to be. Right? You are born and you will die. Your potentially to not be is evident from the fact that there was a time when you were not and will not be, but right now you are. Right? We all understand that. But it is impossible for things to always exist, for which is possible to be at some point is not. Therefore, if everything is possible not to be, then at one time there could have been nothing in existence. Right, so some people will kind of move on from this, but right, if it's possible that at one time everything could have not been, then there's no reason why anything would have been. Given the scope of infinity, right now there would be nothing. Right, the likelihood of there being something, if not everything needed to be there, and we just happen to catch this little window of existence before everything blips out and doesn't exist anymore, is mathematically improbable to the point that you could just say it's not possible, is the argument that Aquinas is making here. So, as he said, therefore, if at one time nothing was in existence, it would have been impossible for anything to have begun to exist. Thus, even now, nothing would be in existence. which is of course absurd because we're discussing this, so we know you exist. Therefore, not all beings are merely possible, but there must exist something, the existence of which is necessary. So not everything always is. Sometimes something must be necessary. But every necessary thing either has its necessity caused by another or not. Somebody else weighs in and makes this the case or not. Now it is impossible to go on to infinity in necessary things which have their necessity caused by another, as has already been proved in regard to efficient causes. Therefore, we cannot but postulate the existence of some being having of itself its own necessity, and not receiving it from another, but rather causing in others their necessity. All right, there must be something that is necessary and isn't necessary because something else makes it necessary, but it's necessary because it's necessary. And of course, this we would refer to as God. Now, these three cosmological proofs are all pretty much taken from Aristotle and just applied a little bit further. Aristotle has three proofs for the existence of God, and these are those, more or less. Now, the fourth and fifth ways are teleological discussions, right? They're not talking about cosmological from the nature of the cosmos, but rather where things are moving towards. It says the fourth way is taken from the gradation to be found in things. Among beings, there are some more and some less good, true, noble, and the like. But more and less are predicated of different things according to what they resemble, different ways, something to which it's maxim. As a thing is said to be hotter according to as much it resembles that which is the hottest. As there are things that are hot, so too are there other things, right? The truest, the best, something the noblest, and consequently something that is the uttermost being. For those things that are the greatest in truth are greatest in being. Now, the maximum in any genius is the cause of all of that genius, as fire is the maximum of heat, is the cause of hot things. Therefore, we must also have something to which all beings are the cause of their goodness and any other perfection, and this we call God. Now, see, what's interesting here is that Aquinas is talking about how there is lack of something, and therefore there must be the most of this thing, as there is a gradation. Now, this is probably one of the hardest proofs to accept, and has the easiest sort of way of rejecting anything, right? Because does there have to be the hottest thing? Can't there just be a floor but not a ceiling, as it were? Could that be also the case with goodness? Can we have different types of goods that maybe even are at odds with each other and doesn't necessarily make one ultimately there, and therefore it doesn't have to be an ultimate good? But Aquinas disagreed, and that's kind of the way that goes. So you can either like it or not, find critiques of it or not, same as you can with all of them. But this one does get a little bit more tricky in some ways, as we don't always view the world in the exact same way that Aquinas does in this respect. The fifth is taken from the governance of the world. It says that we see that things which lack intelligence, such as natural bodies, act for an end, and this is evident in their acting always or nearly always in the same way, so as to obtain the best result. Hence it is plain that not fortuitously, but designedly, that they achieve their end. Now, whatever lacks intelligence cannot move towards an end unless it is directed by some being endowed with knowledge and intelligence. As an arrow doesn't simply fly into the target, right? But it is a shot that is marked by the archer. Therefore, some intelligent being exists by whom all natural things are directed towards their end, and that being we call God. Here, the idea is that there is a lot of things that lack intelligence and yet are able to produce something. Now, how is it they're able to go to what works best? There is a critique and argument that it's just all random luck and chance, and we've had enough time that this allows for everything to eventually line up perfect, and it would be incorrect to assume that everything that wasn't perfect didn't already exist and fail. Maybe the imperfect have failed, and therefore we only see perfection, and that's our lack of understanding, or it's an assumption and a lack of sample size to see indeed that this is the case. But in any case, Aquinas thinks that the lack of intelligence of things shows that there must be some sort of director or cause or advancing what is supposed to be there. Impulse must be placed in there by some sort of outside source. There must be some sort of value that's going to allow for something to work. And of course, this ultimate source, this intelligence that moves humanity, the cosmos, people, is not just obscure, physics or just random luck, but is indeed belonging to an agent who has moved these things forward. It's very important for Aquinas too to look at the notion of intention. We find this in the first part of the second part, question 12. This addresses how the notion of intention is concerned, and this is very much related to Abelard as well, as we'll get to that later. He says, I answer that intention, as the very word denotes, signifies to tend to something. Consequently, intention belongs first and principally to that which moves to the end. Hence, we say that an architect or someone who is an authority by his command moves others to that which he intends. Right, so this is what intention is that it's the tending towards something and the movement towards something. And this is really going to make a little bit more sense when we talk about other notions of intentionality. But what does it mean to be intentional? It means that you're thinking about it, that you've got volition and will, and therefore that also implies to other things like you have volition and will, that you have intention, that you have identity, right? That these are all things that are wrapped up and connected with that. Reading the Summa can be a little difficult. In many ways, it's very straightforward, and this is an appeal that a lot of people have, is that you can easily read it and understand it. For others, though, it does still have some difficulty. And so I would encourage all of you to watch the link below, watch this video that is also provided in Canvas. And thankfully, there's some Dominicans who've walked through it and said, hey, this is how you should read it. This is how you should approach it. Because for the Dominicans, this is the source and answer of philosophical and theological thought. I got my master's amongst Dominicans, and I can tell you, this is how they saw things. This is where things are going to go for them. After that, I think that it's really important that you guys engage one another through discussions with the Summa. You should go ahead and read one or two of the different articles that exist within there that I've provided, or if you have another one that you'd like to kind of bring in, preferably not one on the proofs of the existence of God, as we've already kind of covered that. Try to see what connections you have. Do you see a connection with Aristotle? Do you see a connection with Augustine or some other philosophers that you're aware of? Try to summarize what is the argument, what does it work, is an appeal to faith, to reason, to some sort of authority. Why do you think this argument exists? Who is the audience? Is it an apology or an exercise of some sort of reason? Do you think that it's valid or not? Do you like the conclusions but not the methodology, or the methodology but not the conclusion? Go through all this and see, and the discussion boards is a great opportunity for you to kind of go through and address all of these in that way. So today we have addressed kind of the life and some of the works of St. Thomas Aquinas. Again, he wrote so proficiently on so many different things, it'd be really hard to single any of these out. But his proofs for the existence of God is a good starting point for many others. And again, play around with some of the other ones. They're a little on the dry side, but it's still straightforward and understandable. As I mentioned, I got my master's amongst a bunch of Dominicans, and I would hear arguments as far as a philosophical question or otherwise, and then all of a sudden one of them just goes, okay, no, let's stop. And they went back and they ran to the Summa, and they found the section and addressed it, and this was kind of the way their life went. Right? Some of the arguments might appear to be mere straw, in your opinion. Others of them are seen as deep and profound. And so I would encourage all of you to kind of play around with Aquinas, do some reading of this, and kind of see how he becomes really that pivotal point in medieval philosophy, where Aristotle is being incorporated and brought in, but adjusted as need be. At least this is the way Aquinas saw it himself before moving forward. If you have any other questions, feel free to let me know. Otherwise, open up those discussion boards and play around with Aquinas and what you guys like and what you guys don't. All right. Thank you.